All right, let's do this. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. It's time for another exciting lightning talk. I'm Parag Katkar, your host for tonight. I'm the head of consulting practices at InRhythm, and we have a lot of exciting content lined up for you in the upcoming weeks. Our lightning talks are hosted every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. And each week, one of our practice area consultants speaks on the latest and greatest design and technology trends in the industry that will keep you learning and growing in your career. And this week, Rebecca LeVine, who is a senior UX designer with us, is going to talk on design thinking and how it applies to designers as well as developers. And I'm really excited about this talk. So without further ado, let's get it started, Rebecca.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and to be talking to you all. And what I'm going to talk about is best practices for designers and developers. Specifically, I'll talk about some actual kind of particular best practices. But really what I want to talk about is how my team and I sort of got to these. So using some UX methodologies and design thinking, even though we're not, in this case, designing a product, but how that kind of thinking could be applied to essentially solving more of a technological and kind of business related problem under kind of particular industry specific constraints. So just a little background. The client I work on is a large financial services firm, and I'm as Parag said, a UX designer there. I generally work with developers, product managers, client services reps, and other designers on products for external clients, which are mostly hedge funds. And the other designers and I had noticed and wanted to address some consistent pain points that we had seen with developers, many having to do with Figma, which is the design software we use, and specifically around these kind of technical and security related constraints that just are part of working for a company in this industry. So I'll take a quick detour here just to talk a little bit about Figma. Some of you may be familiar with it, but it's sort of the industry standard for designing and prototyping. It's cloud-based and there's great real-time collaboration. So sort of like Google Docs, multiple people can be in one file working on editing together, and it all happens in real time. There's a desktop app, or you can use it in a browser window. And then while designers work on creating the actual designs, there's also this inspect panel, which you can see on the right in this screenshot here, which provides information for developers. So CSS, UI specs, just a lot of really useful stuff there. And in Figma, you can also create really realistic interactive prototypes. So a way for somebody who is testing the product or a stakeholder or a developer to really see how the screens are meant to interact rather than just seeing them lined up and static. So that's all great, but the problem here is that Figma renders really poorly on the PCs and remote desktops at the firm where I work. This has to do, again, with the sort of security infrastructure that just doesn't mesh well with Figma. So while designers are allowed to use Figma on their Macs outside of this whole system, developers are limited to the firm's PCs and remote desktops. So they end up with a really subpar Figma experience. What happens is they get like really blurry, low res looking screens. I design a lot of screens that are very dense, data heavy. There'll be grids with a lot of rows and columns, things like that. So it ends up being hard to read. The other issue is that the hotspots in a prototype aren't always visible. So when you're in a prototype in Figma, the way it should work is that if you're not sure where to click on a screen, if you just tap your mouse, these little blue boxes, like you can see in this screenshot, will appear. And so okay, I can click this button or I can click this button. But on the firm PCs, those just don't always show up. So a developer who's trying to see where the interactions are, they're not always going to get a good sense. Also had issues where these strange sort of slash marks would appear across the screen. So no matter how beautiful that we had made these designs, they always looked pretty terrible. And then just not loading or crashing really easily. More than one file being open at a time, or a really heavy file would just refuse to cooperate at all. So we were, getting concerned about some of this, especially with just the amount of design work it seemed like could be lost in translation. We also became concerned that developers' knowledge of Figma may be more limited than we thought. It's very intuitive when you're just working on it on your Mac, and I think we all thought, it's developers, they can figure this out. But it's so hard to use on the firm's PCs that there was a lot they were just missing. Another issue we'd run into is just documentation being spread out between email, Jira, Confluence, Figma. That's an issue that's going to come up at probably most companies and most industries. So then in thinking about what we wanted to do about it, there's not a lot we can do about the security infrastructure. We're certainly not moving to a different software anytime soon, but we really felt like there has to be a way to improve this. So UX designers like to sort of approach these problems by phrasing it as a question that starts with how might we? So here we were thinking, how might we improve how designers and developers work together under the existing constraints? And the answer to that essentially is by applying the principles of design thinking. So design thinking sort of underscores all of modern UX. The idea is that it's sort of nonlinear, it's iterative, and it's really placing the needs of the end user first. So even though it's nonlinear, you're usually going to start with this point about empathy, finding out from end users what the problems are, what they want to see, what they like, what they hate, and really prioritizing their needs rather than what we think their needs are. From there, you're defining what it is that you've discovered through the empathy process, then ideating and prototyping, and then testing, and sort of then repeating this process as needed. So when you're doing product design, you're going to have your prototype, test it with as many users as possible, go back to ideation, maybe go back to definition, maybe go all the way back to just that initial empathy process. So that's sort of how it works when you're designing an actual product. But we decided we wanted to sort of apply a version of this to the problem that we were setting out to solve. So starting with that empathy question, we wanted to know, what is it that the developers are experiencing and what are their pain points? We think we know what they are, but we want to find out more. So we started out with just a workshop among ourselves, a team of the 5 UX designers. We used a feature in Figma called FigJam, which is sort of like a big whiteboard where you can have some virtual sticky notes and that type of thing. And we just did some brainstorming about, what works well with developers, where we've run into issues, and what questions we have. So we spent some time doing that, and then we grouped our individual answers by theme, and found a lot of overlap, not surprisingly. And then out of this workshop, we generated about 15 questions. I won't go into all of them, but generally kind of 3 buckets. So what are developers' preferences on how designers use Figma? How do they use Figma? And what is their knowledge base like? And just to get then a clearer picture of the limitations and issues with the firm's PCs. So armed with our list of questions, we sat down with our interviewees and really tried to get a sense of what is it that they've been experiencing. Our takeaways, I'll just go into now. So some preferences for designer usage, things like storyboards, they like clear labeling, good documentation, all not unexpected. They also really emphasize that it's important for designs to include things like corner cases, empty states, error states, really sort of having that thoroughness from the get-go so it's not a scramble at the end, as well as designs for multiple breakpoints. We also found that in terms of their usage and knowledge, some weren't using the editor view at all, which is this, and that has this CSS and other information. Some did use it, found it helpful for those specs and that kind of bird's eye view, but they weren't all aware of that it even existed. And then, getting really sort of into the heart of the matter, the issues with the firm's PCs. So Figma being slow, the interactions not working very well. The most chilling moment for me, I was interviewing a developer and they told me that because these hotspots don't always appear, what they end up doing is, I don't know if you can see on here, but there's these little arrows underneath this prototype. And rather than clicking the clickable spots in the prototype, because they weren't obvious and sometimes didn't show up at all, what this developer was doing was just scrolling through screen by screen. So not getting any sense of the interactions of the prototypes. It might as well have been that we printed out each screen, shuffled the papers, and then handed them to the developers. It was very alarming to hear that. And then, again, makes a great deal of sense. Given these limitations, developers would love an alternative to Figma. So with this information, we decided to really sort of define what our tasks would be. Again, there was a limited amount that we could do in terms of really changing the technology, but we felt like there are some concrete steps that we can take here. So we decided that we want to be able to better communicate how to use Figma, really make sure that the developers are getting the most out of it, even if they are on the firm's machines, and better organization of links and files. One thing we had found was that smaller files work better on the firm's machines than larger files, but smaller files means more files. So just keeping track of everything and having really clear documentation was going to be important. So then into the steps of ideation and prototyping. So here we are brainstorming, considering different approaches, iterating, revising, editing, really trying to put something together that would most effectively respond to the needs of our users, in this case, the developers. So on the Figma knowledge front, one of my colleagues had put together a deck that was sort of a whole tutorial on how to use Figma for developers. She'd presented that about a year ago. We considered doing another presentation of that, maybe trying to make it a quarterly thing where it could just sort of be a refresher course for developers. But of course, that's another meeting on people's calendars. And we just felt that something more concise that we could share consistently would actually be a more effective way of sharing that information. So we put together kind of an email widget. It's really just a little cheat sheet about how to use Figma. So things that to us are kind of second nature, but if devs didn't know them, they were really missing out on a lot. So things about navigation, how different ways of viewing the prototypes, keyboard shortcuts, and then really how to use that editor view. So essentially we put all of this, made it sort of as concise as possible, and essentially are using it like an email signature whenever we are emailing with developers about design files. So it's got like a blue background, so it's easily sort of called out, and it's just sort of there always as a reference point. And then to manage the organization and documentation piece, we made a template in Confluence that any designer can copy and customize as they need. And the idea would be that for every project you do, you would make one of these pages, and it would have links to sort of it would have all the important links. So things like the editor view, the prototype view. It might be that if there's lots of different flows within a particular prototype, that you would link to each view separately. If the files got too big and weren't working on the firm's PCs, and you had a different Figma file for every single flow, as could be the case, you would link to each one in this document. We'd set it up as a table with rows and columns. So there's a column for the data current as of, a column for, is this ready for handoff? In some cases, there could be designs that are minimum viable product, as opposed to target state. So having separate places. So if you want to link to each of those separately, you could. And then this page would also include links to related files and reference files. So if it's a grid page and this developer has worked on similar grids for something different, you could link directly to those Figma files, as well as to reference files. So for instance, we have a page template that we use for a lot of our designs. So linking just to the generic version of that, just as a reference point for developers. And then we also included that same little cheat sheet that was in the email widget here as well. So just, having it sort of in front of people's eyes as often as possible. And then the idea with this is we would share the Confluence page with developers and other stakeholders if that's relevant. Ask them to bookmark it and just sort of say, this is the source of truth on this. All links will be kept up to date here, so you don't have to spend time scrolling through your email. So we are now in the test and assessment phase, where at this point we have gotten some positive feedback. We've also just sort of anecdotally observed fewer of the type of questions like, how do I get to the editor view, and things like that. So that's certainly been encouraging. We are continuing to gather feedback from our primary users, in this case, developers. We're going to sort of put it out to a larger audience soon. We've sort of done a soft launch so far. And we've also been gathering other ideas from designers outside our team elsewhere at the firm. So to sum up, really what this experience has been about, I find, is applying design thinking beyond how we typically think about design. So we did come away with concrete steps and materials to improve the designer developer workflow that I would be happy to share with other designers and developers. I think anyone working somewhere where there are these kind of limitations on software or on communications, having these kind of workarounds can be really helpful. But more than that, what was important to us here was to apply these UX principles beyond product design. And in a way, it's really exciting to have our users be our coworkers and collaborators rather than clients who we have less face time with. And being able to improve their and our experience has been really rewarding. So thank you so much. That is all I have.